So when most people think of a holiday-themed review, they would think of something that would be really festive and appropriate and probably pretty upbeat, like, say, Holiday Hair, the Jazz Jackrabbit edition, for lack of a better term anyway. It's very festive, it's very upbeat, and it's certainly perfectly reasonable to expect a review like that. I mean, most people do that. But if you've been tuning into my channel for a while, you know that that's not really my style. Most people would think of something like Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, or Santa Claus, or, of course, the various religious festivals that are going on around this time of year. So I decided to try to do things a bit different this year compared to how I've been doing it in previous years, and look and see if I could find something that was truly festive to actually review for this year. And so when I was going through my games collection and trying to find it, I think I found the ultimate solution for this year's holiday review. Because what says the spirit of the holidays better than the flesh of fallen angels? Happy holidays, everyone. This is my review of Max Payne for PC, Mac, PlayStation 2, Xbox, and oddly enough, Game Boy Advance, although the Game Boy Advance version is wildly different from the actual PC and console versions. Obviously, what you're seeing here is the PC version, and I'm going to be perfectly honest with you people going into this review. This is one of my favorite video games of all time across all genres. And I hope that I'm able to convey why that is throughout the course of this review. But just because this is one of my favorite video games does not mean I can't be objective about it. Because it's certainly not without its problems, and those can make or break the game for you. So let's go ahead and get things started. This is a third-person shooter developed by Remedy Entertainment and originally published by Gathering of Developers, although 2K now owns the rights to it. And it was first released for PC in 2001. It later saw a release on PlayStation and Xbox, and eventually Mac and Game Boy Advance as well, and went on to become a very successful media franchise, spanning, of course, 3 video games in total. You had Max Payne 2, The Fall of Max Payne, and of course Max Payne 3, which was an abject travesty. But anyway, I digress. There was also a film starring Mark Wahlberg, and let's face it, that movie was garbage. But regardless, it's really not all that often that you do see a video game adapted into a movie, especially when the game was so heavily influenced by movies to begin with. So with some of that background information out of the way, let's go ahead and start delving into this game and see if it lives up to the hype, or if I'm just being horrendously nostalgic over it. Well, as far as presentation goes, it's certainly extremely dated. You have very blocky modeling, very simplistic animations, and for the time they were fantastic textures, but in hindsight, they're definitely very low res. That said, the particle effects are still surprisingly good, so it's got that going for it. But if you go into this game now, then it's going to look extremely dated and going to be very difficult for a gamer that is used to modern graphics to adjust to. That said, this game does do something rather interesting with its cutscenes, which is, instead of having traditional in-game cutscenes, which it does do that as well, the vast majority of the major cutscenes in this game are actually graphic novel style. So there are a bunch of still images with speech bubbles and narration bubbles while the various characters are talking over things, which is rather unique because I can't name another game off the top of my head other than Max Payne 2 that has the same kind of presentation. Now that said, those graphic novel style cutscenes are actually very cheesy in the grand scheme of things, and that's partly due to the actual voice acting and especially the writing. Because one of the very first things you'll notice about the game is that it is a work of neo-noir. This means that Max tends to describe things in a very overly poetic and extremely verbose manner.
Mercury was falling fast. It was colder than the devil's heart, raining ice pitchforks as if the heavens were ready to fall. Everyone was running for shelter like there was no tomorrow. It didn't get any better when I got to the subway. I came in from the cold and the dark. Outside the city was a cruel monster. Freezing wind tearing at my face like sandpaper and razors, ice hard and slick under my hands and feet. And somewhere in the background, the wail of sirens, the city howling after me. Dark sped by and fast forward, dark rooftop water towers and a dead forest of antennas and chimneys, all a blur.
Now to most of you out there, that'll probably seem ridiculously cheesy, but I friggin' love it. They fully commit to the noir-style narration, and with Max having such a gravelly, frankly goofy voice, it just works. And if you're thinking that the game is taking itself too seriously, eventually it starts breaking the fourth wall considerably, with frankly one of my favorite fourth wall breaks in gaming history, so I don't want to spoil that for you, but it always gets me laughing every single time I see it. And that deadpan narration and the goofy, exaggerated accents on various other characters are really what make things like that work so well. Even though those lines they're saying are ridiculously cheesy, and even though the accents are completely over-exaggerated in most cases, it just ends up working because the game is so self-aware. Throughout the presentation, it wears its influences on its sleeve, and frankly, it's a lot better for it. So even though the voice acting generally is rather cheesy, it works extremely well for the game and ends up being propelled into much better status than you would think it would be considering how goofy it is. Beyond the voice acting, however, you do have a soundtrack that generally fits the game very well. It has some action-oriented tracks for when you get in the middle of a heavy gunfight, and it has a whole lot more tracks that are more ambient and trying to instill this sort of grim atmosphere, and they generally work very well. And then of course there's the main theme of the game, which is instantly recognizable outside of the game and has become something of an iconic tune. But here's the thing, the main theme is really the only instantly recognizable track from the game, because all the rest of the stuff is so muted that you don't really notice it most of the time. It tends to blend together with the background sounds in order to create a nice sense of ambiance. And speaking of sound effects, the vast majority of the sound effects in the game are actually rather solid, it's just that they don't have the really nice bassy punch that I would like. Even the more powerful weapons, for example, don't sound particularly powerful. They also don't sound weak, but they're fairly muted sound effects that don't really have a lot of kick to them. Same kind of thing goes for the explosion sounds. So when you bring all the presentation together, what you have is extremely dated. I mean, for example, they don't even have facial animations. They have still images that show up as the face textures, and those tend to have very abrupt and very noticeable transitions that are instantly going from one image to the other, so they just look pretty ridiculous. And on top of that, everything else in the game looks dated as well, and the sound design is kind of all over the place. But despite the problems, the presentation holds up surprisingly well, and what you end up with is something that just plain works, even though it's been so long after the game's release. But here's the thing, regardless of how well the presentation still holds up, what ultimately matter here are the story and the gameplay. The story in this is that you play as former detective Max Payne, who is currently working undercover to try to find the source of the designer drug Valkyr and try to help take them down, because 3 years prior to the events of the game, some junkies that were high on Valkyr invaded his home and ended up murdering his wife and daughter. Only things go horribly wrong when he tries to meet up with his friend and handler Alex in a subway, and Alex ends up getting murdered himself, and then Payne becomes the prime suspect. So now, with nothing to lose, he's basically trying to find whoever put Valkyr out on the streets and take down anyone who gets in his way of doing that. This ultimately uncovers a much larger conspiracy regarding the drug and where it actually comes from, and I'm not going to spoil any of that for you, but suffice to say, it is a fairly predictable storyline. They do try to work in a few twists here and there that make things a lot more interesting, but by and large, you can pretty much see where the plot is going right from the get-go. The thing is, that's not necessarily a bad thing in this game's case, because the writers knew exactly what they were doing with it. So sure, the story is fairly predictable, but it's the way that it's told that makes things a lot more interesting, and that combines with the very cinematic style of gameplay that they've gone for here, which is heavily influenced by John Woo and The Matrix. It uses bullet time slow-mo to extremely good effect, because not only can you just switch on the slow-mo effect and then start running around and shooting stuff, but you can also use it to do shoot-dodge maneuvers, where you'll dive one direction and you'll be able to keep shooting while you're diving. But you can't just stay in bullet time. You're going to need to use it sparingly because you have a bullet time meter, and you recharge that by killing enemies. Now, of course, that's easier said than done, not just because the game is difficult, but because you have to get used to the way the gun mechanics work. You see, whenever you fire your guns in this, it always sends out projectiles rather than just straight up hit scan. This means that your shots don't immediately connect. It usually takes about a second for it to hit whatever it is you're aiming at. So a lot of the time you'll need to aim ahead of a target in order to actually be able to hit it, and you may even need to adjust your aim in order to get the projectile to go from where the barrel of the gun is to whatever it is you're aiming at. This actually does take quite a bit of time to get used to, because most third-person shooters out there, or just shooters in general, are so reliant on hit scan, which is instantly hitting whatever it is you're trying to shoot. This means there's a lot more skill involved in actually being able to aim at your opponents in Max Payne. Or, because the effects actually apply to both you and the enemies, then you can actually use this to dodge bullets as well. And you're going to be needing to do that because one thing you'll notice about Max Payne very quickly is that you really can't take a lot of damage. Oh sure, you do have a health meter, but it seems like your health meter can randomly go from full to empty with a single shot, or sometimes it takes several shots. It's just wildly dependent on the situation. And unlike in other games out there, you don't use med kits or anything of that nature to replenish your health. Instead, you use painkillers. So effectively, the health meter is more of a pain meter, like how much pain tolerance Max has. So if it just bottoms out, then he loses all of his resolve and just ends up dying of his wounds that he's probably sustained dozens of over the course of the game. At least that's the way I choose to see it, because it's the only way the thematic elements make sense. Anyway, you can have up to 8 painkillers in your inventory at any time, and whenever you use one, it slowly replenishes health instead of just immediately giving it all back to you. So you do need to be careful with that, and you're going to find very quickly that even with the shoot dodging and even with those painkillers, you are going to get your ass handed to you constantly. And that is because Max Payne isn't just difficult, it's punishingly difficult. There is barely any room for error in the game at all, and even the times where it does give you some room for error, more often than not, it'll throw you into a scenario that's almost unwinnable unless you take your time and you really start to plan things out. It becomes a very delicate balance of when to use your bullet time versus when to conserve it, as well as what weapons to use in a given situation. Because you may say to yourself, oh, well, I'm using the most powerful weapon I have at any given moment. Well, that may not necessarily be ideal for the situation at hand. Although I've never really found a good use for the sawed-off shotgun, because the spread is just too ridiculous on it. But most of the time you will be able to find a good use for the rest of your arsenal, although certain weapons do pretty much supplant others when you get further into the game. For example, once you get the jackhammer shotgun, there's really no reason at all to use the pump or the sawed-off shotguns. It uses the same ammo, and it's just better because it's a fully automatic shotgun, which means that the volume of fire you can put down with that thing is just insane. So they certainly could have handled the weapon balancing a bit better, and they definitely could have handled the difficulty a lot better, because once you get toward the middle and especially the end of the game, the difficulty just ratchets up to a pretty much insane degree and makes certain segments of the game barely even winnable at all. But the thing is, that's also where all the really interesting stuff happens with regards to gameplay mechanics as well as the storytelling. To give you a prime example, there's one particular segment of the game where he's going through a dream sequence and he's having to run through lines of blood in a maze of effectively the same pathways until eventually he manages to get out of the nightmare. And that whole sequence is awesome, but then you wake up and you're down to nothing but a baseball bat against guys with machine guns and shotguns. It doesn't really go well. And that's the kind of problem you'll notice, because it'll have these really great sequences where there's a really fantastic, intense shootout, or it'll have a dream sequence where things get all wacky and weird, or it'll just have some really intense storytelling moments, and then it'll just kind of peter out a bit by throwing in a segment that's frankly bullshit in terms of difficulty. The quick save button becomes your best friend, and that's something that a lot of people have forgotten about because the quick save option has not been in games for quite a while now. But that's one of the really cool things about Max Payne. Even though it does have some pretty severe bullshit difficulty moments, usually you can find a way to work around it. Either you can make liberal use of the bullet time, or you can quick save and actually just pick up where you left off, or something along those lines, in order to get around some of the game's problems. Could it have been better designed? Absolutely, and frankly, it should have been better designed. But even with those design problems, the game still ends up being an absolute joy to play. And the difficulty, oddly enough, ends up being a part of the charm that makes it so lovable. I mean, it's not that surprising that the odds are completely stacked against you, because you look at the thematic elements and the odds are completely stacked against Max to begin with. And when you combine that with that neo-noir style storytelling as well as the action movie elements like the bullet time and the shoot dodging and things like that, you end up with a game that just plain works despite its problems. But here's the thing, even though it works, that does not mean this is a game for everyone. It's nothing remotely resembling that, in fact. This is ultimately a game by third-person shooter fans for third-person shooter fans, and within that niche, it's practically unrivaled. It's kind of difficult to describe just how viscerally satisfying it is to dive in slow motion while unloading dual Berettas at a series of thugs, but it just strikes a chord that's immediately satisfying, and on top of that, if you're a fan of neo-noir, then you're getting that goofy neo-noir storytelling. You're getting a game that is fully self-aware, that it understands exactly what it is, and it works to those strengths in terms of its storytelling and its gameplay. And you ultimately get a third-person shooter that I can do basically nothing but recommend, but only if you're in the niche that it caters to, which is fans of third-person shooters. For a more general audience, the difficulty is going to be the big hurdle there. That and the fact that the game came out so long ago and it's looking so dated by modern standards. Not to mention, it does have some compatibility issues with modern operating systems and hardware, so you'll have to do some various tweaks in order to get the sound working, for example, or to get widescreen working, which even though I was able to get it running in 1080p and it works fine when I'm just running around doing normal gameplay, the graphic novel style cutscenes weren't rendered properly, so the menu there didn't actually show up at the bottom of the screen. Really not sure why it did that, but welcome to weird compatibility issues with older software. But despite the technical problems and despite the design problems, when you bring everything together, you just have a ridiculously enjoyable third-person shooter, even though it is often very, very frustrating due to the difficulty. It just oozes style from every pore, and if you're a fan of neo-noir especially, then you will get a big kick out of it. And if you consider the impact it had on gaming as a whole, I mean, it basically put Remedy Entertainment on the map, it helped to popularize bullet time mechanics, and even to this day, it is still a beloved series. All for good reason. This is a game that clearly had a lot of love poured into it by the developers, and it really paid off dividends, which ultimately means I'm giving this a 4.5 out of 5. Again, it's not the kind of thing I would necessarily recommend to a general audience just because it is punishingly difficult. But if you're a fan of third-person shooters, or especially if you're a fan of neo-noir, then you need to get yourself a copy of Max Payne. I will have a link in the video description box to where you can do so if you're interested. Thanks for watching.